Every history class taught you that medieval peasants slept when the sun went down. That is exactly what those in power needed you to believe. The church wrote down confessions. The manor recorded rents. But nobody logged what happened after the last candle. That silence wasn't accidental. It was managed. Because the village of 1070 England had a second life, one that ran entirely outside the reach of lord and priest. And what people did in that darkness tells you more about who they really were than anything carved in stone ever will. That silence had a shape. These were not free people who chose to stay quiet. They were a conquered population. Norman boots had been on English necks for 4 years by 1070. The herring of the north had just finished burning entire counties into famine. The men who survived knew something very specific, that being seen was dangerous, that being remembered was fatal, that the wrong word, overheard by the wrong person, ended in a lord's dungeon or a priest's accusation. Without any grand design, the night village created the same psychological architecture that every occupied population rebuilds instinctively. Invisible community and coded language. Trust maintained through shared risk. Modern states spend billions engineering that kind of social control. These people were already living inside it. And the question is, what does a human being become when survival depends on disappearing in plain sight? We're going to walk through one night. Compline to Lodz. 6 watches. Each one had its own psychology, its own social physics. You'll see how fear mutated as the hours passed, how surveillance tightened, then fractured. The same people who knelt together at dusk were calculating betrayal by midnight. The sequence matters because what terrified them at twilight wasn't what hunted them at the wolf hour. And what they confessed in the pre-dawn cold would have been unthinkable 6 hours earlier. The bell rang. You covered the fire. That was the law. Couvre-feu. Cover the flame. Every hearth in England smothered on command. But here's what the Lord Steward never saw. The ash. You learned to bury a coal so precisely, so carefully, that it could breathe through the night without a single visible glow. Your grandmother taught you. Her grandmother taught her. This wasn't negligence. It was a skill passed down like a prayer. The curfew wasn't about fire safety. It was about darkness as enforcement. No light meant no gathering. No gathering meant no conversation the Lord couldn't control. And yet, the ember survived. Which means the first thing you did when the bell stopped echoing before the steward's footsteps faded was check whether your neighbor's roof still carried heat. The moment the steward's footsteps disappeared into the dark, the village didn't go silent. It went quiet. There's a difference. Silence is empty. Quiet is full of something held back. You already know which houses are watching. You've known since childhood which neighbor owes your father a debt that can't be spoken in daylight. Which girl's father is weighing 2 offers for her hand. Which field boundary shifted 3 feet after the last flooding. Who gained from it? Who is still angry? But Norman law said peasants couldn't assemble, couldn't negotiate, couldn't make agreements without a lord's witness. But Norman law was written for daylight, and daylight had ended. So the debts got settled in doorways. Marriage terms got whispered across fence lines. Land disputes found their resolution in handshakes no court would ever see. The village was running a second government, informal, invisible, entirely its own, and older than anything the Normans had written down. These weren't ignorant serfs waiting for permission to exist. They were building a shadow parliament in the dark, meeting by meeting, debt by debt, generation by generation. At night, fear had 2 sources, and they were in direct competition. Night, fear didn't come from one source. It came from two, and they were in direct competition. The church told you one thing: demons prowl the darkness. Satan himself walks abroad. Your only defense is prayer, confession, holy water. Trust the sacraments. Trust the priests. Trust God. But the village cunning woman, the one 3 cottages down who knew which herbs stopped bleeding, she told you something else entirely. Iron above the doorway. Rowan branches at the threshold. Specific words in a specific order. Old words, words her grandmother taught her. And nobody admits in the Chronicles you did both. You prayed, and you hung the iron. You crossed yourself, and you whispered the charm. You confessed your sins on Sunday, and you paid the cunning woman on Monday. Because when your child woke screaming about the thing in the corner, you weren't interested in theological consistency. You were interested in what worked. So the village developed this hybrid system, this syncretic panic protocol, Christian prayers wrapped around pagan iron, sanctioned ritual mixed with forbidden practice. Everyone knew it. Everyone participated. And everyone pretended they didn't, which brought you to the hours themselves. You didn't sleep through the night. Nobody did. The history books skip this part. Not because it's unimportant, because it looks on the surface like nothing. A man rising at the 2nd hour. A woman checking a latch. Someone murmuring Latin in the dark. But watch it more carefully. The church had given you a gift without meaning to. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, the prescribed prayers that broke your sleep into sanctioned pieces. Those weren't just devotion. They were permission to be awake, to move, to investigate that sound near the grain store without anyone asking why you were out of bed at the wrong hour. Your neighbor heard you praying. Good. That's what you wanted them to hear. Because what you were actually doing was checking whether the salt pork was still where you'd left it, whether the latch on the pig enclosure was holding, whether the sound that pulled you from sleep was the wind or something else sharing the darkness with you. Here's what makes this strange. The reeve, the man responsible for managing everyone's labor and movement, had no formal authority over the night. And in that gap, a second authority grew. A shadow system. Informal, unrecorded, passed between households in glances and half-sentences at the well. A rotating vigilance that no lord ever commissioned and no chronicle ever named. Which means someone decided who watched and when. Someone was running the dark. They were running from everything at once. That's the honest answer. A wolf could take a child, not as metaphor, as fact. In 1070, wolves still moved through English woodland in numbers that made the forest edge a genuine boundary between the known and the lethal. You knew this. Your body knew this in a way that no amount of daylight reasoning could fully undo. But here is where it gets darker. The church had a position on fear, specifically on yours. To lie awake, parsing sounds, trying to determine whether that movement outside was animal, human, or wind, was to exercise a judgment that belonged to God alone. The night was his dominion, and your anxiety was spiritual trust, pray, sleep. So you were caught. Survival instinct pulling you toward the window. Theology pulling you back to the bed. And somewhere outside, something moving. The sounds themselves weren't random. You had a catalog by now. The particular creak of the pen when an animal shifted weight. The way the wind behaved differently through bare branches versus heavy leaf. You knew these things the way you know a familiar voice, but knowledge and certainty are different countries. And at the 3rd hour, in genuine darkness, with exhaustion pressing down on every rational thought you owned, certainty was gone. What remained was the older, quieter question. Not what made the sound, but who or what already knew you were here. You weren't the only one awake, and not everyone watching had the same reason to watch. The Reeve chose one watchman, the Lord's man, the one whose name appeared on the tax roll, whose presence was reported back to the manor each dawn. Official, sanctioned, loyal, but the village kept 3 more. Men who rotated on a schedule the Normans never saw, chosen not by birth or favor, but by something sharper, by who knew the difference between a fox in the henhouse and a boot on gravel, by who could be trusted when a neighbor's grain went missing versus when a stranger's shadow crossed the green, by who understood that loyalty to the manor and loyalty to survival were not always the same thing. This wasn't rebellion in the way you picture it. No meetings, no declarations, just a quiet agreement passed in glances during Sunday Mass, confirmed with a nod at the well. The kind of conspiracy that leaves no record because no one ever spoke it aloud. Who was watching the watchers? Everyone. And no one. And then came the hour that undid everything. Not midnight. Not the deepest dark. The hour just before first light, when the sky shifts from black to the color of old iron. That hour belonged to no one, and everyone was afraid of it, because that was when the Reeve woke up. He was the Lord's eyes on the ground. His job was to walk the village at dawn and see what the night had left behind. Tracks in mud, ash in a hearth that should have been cold, a door not quite latched the way it was at dusk. He wasn't looking for proof of anything specific. He was looking for the shape of a lie, and you knew this. You'd always known this. So the last hour of darkness wasn't rest. It was labor. Quiet, frantic, coordinated labor. You swept the hearth. You moved the straw. You made sure the dog was tied where it should be, that the bucket was exactly where it had been the evening before. Not because you'd done anything wrong necessarily, but because innocence in 1070 was something you had to construct from scratch every single morning. Your neighbors were doing the same thing. No one said a word. No one needed to. The whole village was performing waking up together in silence. They weren't erasing guilt. They were erasing evidence of survival. And surviving the night required its own set of tools. Because surviving the night in 1070 required tools, specific ones. And none of them were ever written down, because writing them down would have been its own kind of confession. Start with the hinges. Rendered fat, packed into the iron joints of a door, meant a door that opened without sound. No creak. No announcement. You could move through your own home like it belonged to someone else, which, in a very real sense under Norman land law, it did. That silence wasn't comfort. It was calculation. Then the ash. Hearth ash spread in thin lines across thresholds and pathways wasn't superstition. It was a navigation system. You knew your own pattern. A stranger's foot would break it. Your own trained eye, half asleep at 3 in the morning, could read a disturbed ash line the way you'd read a word instantly without thinking. And the sounds. Every village had them. A particular cough that meant stay inside. A dog tied in one spot meant safety. Shifted to another, it meant the opposite. Children learned these codes before they learned prayers. Probably before they learned their own names. This was an entire material culture built in a single generation. No craftsman guild recorded it. No lord commissioned it. It existed only in the body, in muscle memory and midnight habit. What exactly were they hiding from? Not the Normans. That's the easy answer, and it's wrong. The real threat was each other. Because here's what no one tells you about medieval villages. They had courts, night courts, unofficial, unrecorded, absolutely real. A stolen loaf meant a house visit after dark. A neighbor's pig in your garden? That got settled by firelight with witnesses you couldn't see but knew were watching. They had enforcement. The hue and cry wasn't just for daytime thieves. At night, it meant something sharper, a signal that sent men pouring into the dark with tools that weren't tools anymore. And if you didn't come when called, you were naming yourself. They had laws that never saw parchment. Who could move after curfew and who couldn't? Which paths were neutral ground and which belonged to specific families after sunset? What debts could wait and which ones got collected in the dark with interest that had nothing to do with silver? This wasn't chaos. It was order. A complete parallel government that operated when the official one went to sleep. And it worked. For centuries, it worked. The Normans conquered England in daylight. But the night stayed English, governed by rules older than kingdoms, enforced by people whose names you'll never know. So here's what all of this actually tells you. Not about medieval England, about you. About every person who has ever lived under a system that watched them. When power narrows the exits, people don't stop moving. They move differently. When surveillance claims the daylight, communities claim the dark. When the official story gets written down, the real story goes underground. Passed mouth to ear, remembered in gesture, encoded in roots and signals and silences that leave no record. The Normans thought they were controlling a population. What they were actually doing was teaching that population exactly how much pressure human beings can absorb before they build something invisible to survive it. Every surveillance state makes the same mistake. It assumes that what it cannot see does not exist. It assumes that compliance on the surface means acceptance underneath. It assumes that fear is the same thing as loyalty. The medieval English village proved otherwise, and so did every occupied city that came after it, and every one that will come after those. The template never changed, only the uniforms did. The architecture of survival stayed exactly the same. The Normans had their informants, their reeves, their priests, their loyal tenants watching the tree lines. But who was watching the watchers? You already know the village was never just a village, it was a system. A machine of fear and observation and silent negotiation. And that machine had edges. At the edge was the forest. No reeve followed you there. No priest recorded what you whispered between the trees. The forest had its own rules, its own watchers, its own grammar of survival that never made it into any Norman ledger. That's where we go next. Follow. Because the reconstruction they teach you stops at the village gate. The one we're building doesn't stop anywhere.